I'm Elliot Chodoff, and welcome to Conflict Uncovered, your go-to podcast for in-depth analysis on the complex and dynamic conflicts shaping the Middle East, Israel, and the world. Join us as we delve into the latest developments, historical contexts, and the geopolitical forces at play. We bring you the insights you need to understand the issues that matter most. Stay informed, stay engaged, and uncover the truths behind the headlines. Hi, and welcome. It's December 11th evening here in Israel. And this evening, I'd like to talk a little bit about what's still going on in Syria, not reach any conclusions at the moment. This is more sort of a halftime assessment commentary while everything is still going on, and try to get some sense out of the chaos that, quite frankly, those of us who are following it are trying to run as fast as we can to try to keep up as things are moving very, very quickly on the other side. The international news, for the most part, has been involving Israeli strikes into Syria. The Israeli Air Force struck a reported 350 targets over the past few days, primarily air bases, naval bases, chemical weapon and ballistic missile storage and development plants and areas in what seems to be a very successful attempt to make sure that the Syria that comes out of the fall of Bashar Assad is not a threat to Israel anytime in the immediate future. Along the way, Syria's air defense system was destroyed by the Israeli Air Force, the most densely packed air defense system in the world, supplied by the Russians and upgraded by the Russians over the past few years. This doesn't bode well for Russian anti-aircraft arms sales, but that's their problem, not ours. The world, of course, is condemning it. The United Nations condemned it. The Emirates condemned it. Everybody's condemning it. Nobody really likes it. Interestingly enough, the rebels themselves haven't said anything. They apparently seem to understand what's going on. And the Americans, for a change, are taking something of a wait-and-see attitude as well. So the question is, why is Israel doing it and not responding to the usual gang of Israel's doing it because Israel likes to destroy things and Israel's the aggressor and the occupier and so on and so forth? We need to understand that what just happened in Syria is, in the short term, very positive. The end of the Assad regime, a murderous dictatorship that gassed its own people. The stories are now beginning to come out in detail of what went on in Assad's prisons and in his camps, and what was done in villages and towns, all throughout the country. Just a quick reminder: when Bashar Assad came to power, he was touted by the Western press as the new breath of fresh air, the new type leader. He's a British-trained ophthalmologist with a Vogue cover model wife who's going to reform Syria and turn it into the paradise of democracy and liberalism in the Middle East. Okay, so they got that one wrong again. But now he's out. And the new leadership of Damascus, and I emphatically say Damascus because the leaders in Damascus are not necessarily in control of the country. Whether they ever will be or not is an open question. The organization Hayat Tahrir al-Shams, known in America as HTS, is a spin-off of Al-Qaeda, spin-off of ISIS. Its leader, Jolani, has an American bounty on his head for $10 million. One presumes that they didn't put that bounty on him for, unlicensed sale of Girl Scout cookies. Man has a record as an Al-Qaeda terrorist. And now he's saying all sorts of very friendly things about united Syria and rebuilding the country and freedom for all and that sort of thing. Is he telling the truth? I don't know. However, First, I, and apparently the Israeli leadership, would rather be pleasantly surprised than unpleasantly surprised. If it actually works out this way, it would be wonderful. But let's remember, this is exactly the kind of talk the Taliban was saying when it was negotiating with the Americans about the withdrawal from Afghanistan. It was going to be a new, free, open, unoppressive country, and that didn't work out too well either, as we well know. They're back to their old shenanigans. So, is he serious? Is he not serious? We don't know the answer to that. What we do know is this. He's trying to consolidate power. He has not come anywhere near doing that yet. HTS is in control of Damascus, as I said, but the collapse of the Syrian army, Assad's army, which took everyone by surprise, myself included, the Russians, the Iranians, Hezbollah, the militias, Israeli intelligence, even the Turks, were all surprised by how quickly Assad's army disintegrated. I'll come back to that in a moment. And as a result, we're surprised by the takeover. We have to keep in mind that this tells us less about the strength of the rebels and more about the weakness of the regime. Now, I think that one of the things that was surprising for me, it was very surprising, is that Assad had a regime and a leadership that was so corrupt, so rotten, so corroded, that he was incapable or not interested in establishing at least let's call it a presidential guard corps or some other such title of a couple of divisions, 20,000, 25,000, 30,000 men, loyal to the regime for ethnic reasons, meaning Alawites, for semi-ethnic reasons, meaning Druze and Christians, well-paid, well-equipped, well-trained, well-commanded, and willing to fight, at least stiffly, if not to the death, to defend the capital and the president. Having not done that, his army simply had no traction. Its troops were sent to counterattack, and they simply left their tanks running on the roads, and they ran off the roads on foot. And an uprising resurgence that in all probability believed that it was only going to take Aleppo finds itself in less than 2 weeks taking Damascus. However, the other groups that are out there, including true al-Qaeda groups, Jolani broke away from al-Qaeda a few years ago, not necessarily for ideological reasons. Other rebels, once again, ethnic or otherwise, insurgencies that could come from Hezbollah, that could come from the militias, the Shiite militias, Syrian, Iraqi, and otherwise, and all sorts of other mischief-making, mean that the leadership, Jolani and company, need to do everything they can early on to seem as non-threatening as possible and as inclusive as possible to ward off the possibility of a second uprising against them, a move to take over, and the like. And we should also keep in mind that these types of overthrows, as we've seen now, the overthrow of Assad, are very often followed by second and third wave attack overthrows. In other words, the group that succeeds in throwing out the regime is very often not the group that succeeds in establishing the new regime. That's not a prediction. It's simply analysis of what has been in other places. And this doesn't bode well for the overall situation because typically those who take over in the second and third wave are far more radical than the group that was successful in overthrowing the regime. So that's something we're going to have to wait and see. In the meantime, Israel has learned a very important lesson. It learned it on October 7th. It's a lesson that should have been learned much earlier, but tragically better late than never. And that is not to operate on the wishful thinking of A, our neighbors aren't going to do it. They wouldn't dare do it. They're not really thinking about doing it. And they may have the capabilities, but we don't really think they have the intentions. So as someone who's studied strategic surprise in the past, and a future conversation maybe dealing with it in some depth, surprise is the result of not assessing intentions correctly, and very often knowing the capabilities and saying, well, they have it, but they're not going to use it. And I would contend, and I've argued this in places in the past, that the capability developed by your adversary very often points to their intentions. They don't invest money, effort, energy, resources into a capability that they're not going to use. Now, in this case, the rebels didn't invest in it. They would have it fall into their hands. And by the way, that includes chemical weapons. Remember when back in the Obama days, Bashir promised to give up all of his chemical weapons if America didn't strike. Kerry worked it out with the Russians. Putin was Johnny on the spot, making sure that it was all cleared out. Well, it wasn't. And chemical weapons being what they are, it's not something you want to have fall into the hands of Al-Qaeda types, reformed or otherwise. So we're all in a holding pattern. At the same time, the Israeli military has moved into the disengagement zone. People are saying, reporting that Israel is conquering Syrian territory and taking Syrian land. Well, that's not really the case. Israeli forces are moving into a zone that was part of a UN separation of forces agreement zone from 1974 in the anticipation that we may have to defend ourselves against forces coming from the east, which, by the way, we'd had to deal with all through the decade of the Syrian civil war. The Israeli military is emphatically not moving into populated areas. The idea that it is moving on Damascus is utter nonsense. The distance to Damascus isn't that great, so every step forward you take is moving you toward Damascus. But that's nonsense. It's nowhere near a reality. And my estimate is that over the next few days, we're going to see that line stabilize and Israel go into a serious, let's see what happens mode. We've already put out feelers. Prime Minister Netanyahu made a statement. We'd like relations with the new Syrian government. Of course, a correct but also clever step showing that we don't have an interest in a conflict with Syria. But Israel's moves in this are really not all that important. We're going to have to wait and see what happens internally in Syria as the different ethnic groups try to figure out what's good for themselves and what's best for themselves. And the usual suspects of Iran, Turkey, and Russia trying to figure out for themselves what they want from Syria. The Russians announced that they're going to deal specifically now with Ukraine. They have no room for Syria. The Turks already moving forces into northern Syria, and the Iranians stating that the resistance, meaning attacks on Israel, will continue, and they will continue operating through Syria with Hezbollah, possibly with agreements, and they've made overtures, and for that we'll have to wait and see. So, in a dynamic, volatile time, I'm not going to make predictions, simply having laid out where we're sitting at this point in time. As things develop over the next days and weeks, I'll come back with what I hope will be a deeper and broader analysis. So with that, stay engaged, stay safe. It's December 11th. early evening. It's December 11th, early evening here in Israel. Thank you for listening to Conflict Uncovered. As always, it's been another rough day in the Middle East. We hope you found this episode insightful and engaging. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share and recommend with your friends, and review our podcast on your favorite platform. For more in-depth analysis and exclusive content, join our community and follow us on social media. Stay tuned for our next episode as we continue to explore the critical issues shaping the Middle East and the world. Until next time, stay informed and stay safe.